We chose to use drawboard pegs to attach the breadboard ends to our tabletop. Here's how we do it. So this is our router base that we have. It's adjustable for any width to go on any side of any board. We can center it, we can put it off center, which is really important because on our breadboard ends, we're not going to be centering our mortises. It's going to be closer to the top edge because of the way this is bottom side up, but essentially I've got this end, these edges, and this is going to be much closer to the top. So I'm just using the bottom part of this board for where the tongue will be. Okay, we're going to plunge first with this smaller 1/2 inch bit. Our original plan was to plunge all the way down with the 2 inch bit, but we need the clearance on this bit to fit our 2 inch bit all the way in.
There, right there.
Okay, so that should give us a good flat base and we should be able to route within the hole. This one we want the whole length of the board. We'll clamp this down so it doesn't move. We have our stop areas on each end where we're not going to go past. Okay, we're doing our mortises first so that we can reliably get our tongues to the correct depth and thickness and tune in our tongues to the thickness of our mortise. There are actually two kinds of mortises being plunged here. The full width mortise for the entire breadboard end to fit into is plunged at about a 7/8 of an inch depth. We're leaving about 1/4 of an inch unrouted on the end. Okay, I've marked both of our breadboard ends with blue marker because it's going to be very obvious. It gets a little confusing with lots of different marks on where you're going to route between. We're going to be plunging to the full depth of 2 inches on either end of the mortises, and then gradually clearing out in between the two spaces for each of these mortises. I've also marked where center is for each of them. I have the ends at about 3 inches in on either end. Then I have the center mortise that'll get a peg, and the other peg is going to go halfway between those two, the center and the outer mortise. So we'll have a total of 5 pegs across each board, spaced out evenly, and that'll give a good, pleasing look. The strength of the breadboard end is in the longer tenons that receive the pegs. We're plunging these 2 inches deep, starting one plunge to full depth at each end of the deep mortise and then cleaning out in between the plunges. Having those shallow mortise already cut the full length means less material to clean out and proper alignment with that shallow mortise. Here we are using a 4-foot level as a straight edge guide to run the router against. This will give us a clean edge for the width of the tongues. After we've routed away the edge here, just so that we know exactly where the shoulder is going to be, and I have a nice clean line, except for on the outsides, I'll be tapping away the rest of it with a chisel. I scribed a line using a marking gauge to get the depth of line along the edge here, and that's what I'm tapping into. Maybe see a little line right there. I can just rest my chisel in that line. This line is a little bit proud of the normal width, a little bit wider than my 1/2 inch tongue that I have here, by about a 1/16 or a 32nd of an inch. The tenons are cut to be 3/4 of an inch away from the shoulder, cutting in from the outside. And I'm just using my Japanese pole saw to get these tenons cut. It's actually much easier to do these end cuts with a Japanese saw that I can just be pulling up away from my body than to try and use a traditional Western saw on these, I think, where the angle would be very awkward. I couldn't take this same approach. And the ends of the breadboard itself, I have a little bit of a different design here where the breadboard end is closed and I've got a very shallow, roughly a ½ inch with an 1/8 of an inch overhang here on the end. A very shallow solid piece on the end, followed by a 1/4 of an inch of space. So I've got a 1/4 of an inch of space on either side for my tabletop to expand into the breadboard. Knots are just lovely. And then the full tenon extends almost immediately. So that kind of gives it a little bit of an easing before I hit this full tenon. Then I'll be cutting out the next section. Each of my tenons are 4 inches with evenly spaced gaps between them. Normally, to cut out this tenon where I have the recessed tenon and the longer tenons on the breadboard end, I would be using a fret saw or a jeweler's saw or something like that to cut away the waste, but I don't have that here. I do have a jigsaw that I can use. Not my favorite tool to use, but it'll work. So I'm going to be using a little jigsaw, which I'll be cutting away between here and here. And to do that, I want to cut in a recess, cut in from the other direction, then I'll be able to cut out the lines in between. Sorry if there's any camera jerking, but it's what it is. The next step is to round over these edges just so that they don't have anything that might catch as they slide in the mortises. So I'll just take a chisel and pare off a little bit from each corner, giving it a little bit of a rounded effect. That way it'll also fit into the end of the mortise where it's kind of curved over due to the router bit. I want to use a bench chisel instead of a mortising chisel for this, but again, it's a matter of what do I have. That way you don't have to worry about the sides being sharp. I'll also round over these edges and ensure that they're a good surface as well. Just take the chisel along the edge, about a 45, put a little chamfer on them. Allows it to slide in the mortise a little bit easier. I need a lot of a chamfer, just a bit is good. I'll pare all 4 corners of these to be rounded over like that, so it's essentially the ½ inch radius. That's close enough for my purposes. It doesn't need to be perfect. It is inside the mortise. It's just enough to allow it to slide into that mortise and to use the full length of the mortise that I've done. The other option that I could do is just to cut the mortise square on the end with a mortise chisel, but this is a little bit easier. For the drawboards on the breadboard ends, I've decided to take, it's roughly 1 inch, but it's 1/4 of the distance of the span here. So if I walk my dividers across, I'll get 4. And I'm just lining this up with what I have as center and making a small dimple with my dividers at that point all along. And like I said, they're spaced out evenly. So that's just, we'll drill these through, set it on the breadboard end, and do the offset there by about 1/32 to 1/64 of an inch. And on these tenons, I probably should fill in the end with a little bit more of a spline to go out, fill out the tenon to the end. I'm back at making the pegs. So you can see that this one has some ridges on it, as I pointed out on the 5/16 of an inch. It also has some flattish sides, and that's because this one is not quite fit to the hole. And this is that same peg after having taken it through with the drill bit one more time It's pretty smooth, straight sides. Those ridges are gone. These are the drawbore holes for the tenons. This is the center tenon. This one's just a single hole that'll hold the tabletop to the breadboard end, always in the center. It's not going to have a whole lot of movement. As we go down toward the outside edges, the mortices for the drawbars become slots. This allows the peg to have some lateral movement with normal wood expansion and contraction. As we get towards the outside, the tenons have an even longer slot for the drawbore peg to move in. One of the common mistakes in woodworking joinery is when you try to fit on a piece to like a mortise and tenon together and your joinery is too tight. We had that issue with our breadboard end where trying to pull the tabletop into alignment actually caused a little split on the end of the breadboard the way that we're doing it. So I'll show you what we did to fix that. And this is our breadboard end, and what I have here is a shallow mortise on the end. You can barely see the edge there. Right there is a shallow mortise that goes the full length of the breadboard. And I've got a couple of deep mortises to take the 2-inch deep tenons. On the end here, this is where we noticed a small split coming in here as the breadboard was being pulled into alignment. What we did to fix that is we took some 2-part epoxy, mixed the epoxy together, opened the crack enough to let that epoxy seep in, and then clamped it together to allow that to dry naturally. Now we have a reinforced seam. We put it both inside and out. That epoxy is going to reinforce that crack and help hold it together where it was being forced apart. We made sure that we shaved away the knot on the tenon that was actually forcing this a little bit too wide. Knots in tenon joinery can be a little bit difficult. The edges of the table and the edges of the breadboard and ends all get a slight round over by hand to break this sharp corner, just using 220 and 320 grit sandpaper. The ends of the breadboards where you have end grain showing, that'll get a 400 to 600 sanding so that the finish comes out similar. Don't want a lot of round over, just enough to break the corner. And also this inside corner where it doesn't quite meet the table, I'll give that a slight round over as well. The inside of the breadboard edge, where it meets up with the tabletop itself, is just a straight, sharp edge. We want that nice and crisp. Okay, we're getting ready to put the breadboard ends on, and we're going to put glue just in the center tenon on both the top and the bottom, and also inside the breadboard on the top and bottom. And we have the breadboard marked for where that tenon is. You can also see where it is. We'll put that to full depth. That's the only one that gets glue. We'll also be putting a little bit of glue on the bottom side of the peg, using a Q-tip, end of a Q-tip to get into that hole. The idea there is that the glue that's inserted into that for each of the drawbore holes will only go down, not up, and so that'll help hold the peg firmly in place within the breadboard over time. The way you want this to fit is so that when it's lined up, you can pretty much push the whole thing most of the way into place by hand. And we'll line up that center hole as he pushes it in so that we don't have to do a lot of tapping from one end to the other. You can squish from both of them. And this is our center hole. I can see all the way through that. That's good. Tap in the center. about 1/8 of an inch overhang on either end. We calculated our expansion maximum for this particular area and season changes to be about 1/4 of an inch, and that's for outdoor exposure. That includes the width of the table, the type of wood, and the moisture content change of wood across the year. You can find the links to our reference tables that we used in the video description below. So we sharpen the ends of our pegs just with a pencil sharpener. We've got a little bit of glue on the bottom. We're going to add a little bit of glue as soon as it starts to protrude. We only have that about 1/2 an inch on the top where we want glue to end up, so otherwise we'd be pushing the glue down into the sliding slot. Just a touch. That's good. The center peg has just a tiny bit of a gap around it, and we're going to fill that in. After we cut it off, we'll take some sawdust and shellac as our wood filler and fill that hole in before we finish the tabletop.